speaking, some are trying to get out of speaking, but it's, to me, one of the best events to do. I'm going to start by talking about one of the things as a coach and as a judge that I see as the biggest mistake that we approach coaching student congress with, and that is we don't teach our kids the difference between a bill and a resolution, okay? And there's very specific reasons we have to teach our kids how to separate the two. Let me show you. A bill states that there is a problem, okay, and they both will state that there's a problem, and offer very specific steps to fix the problem, okay? There is implementation methods. There is a timeline on when things will go and be enacted. There's often funding sources offered. There is enforcement mechanisms as to who will enforce those lawbreakers or things like that. So bills are very specific. I went old school and took an example from 2014, so some of you were still in high school then, I'm sure. But like, this is the example. It's talking about free trade with Cuba. Bills are divided by sections, okay? Each section is a clause very specifically to deal with part of it. Like, I know it's hard to see. Opening trade with Cuba will introduce democracy in a socialist country, okay? Section 4 is when, typically Section 4 and Section 5 are the same of every single bill. This bill will take into effect, whenever date that is, and all laws in conflict with this legislation are hereby declared null and void. You'll always want to have those two pieces on, or those two sections on a bill, okay? Super, super important. If you're teaching kids how to write bills, make sure that those last two sections are there. There has to be a timeline and there has to be a statement that says that everything that's in conflict is null and void. The rest can be more specific. Yes, sir?
Why?
Okay.
I get the implementation timeline. But why does everything else have to be null and void?
Because they say, well, that's in conflict with blah, 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 blah. So it's
Right.
just, I mean, it's just like.
The alternative side to that is if you do your research, you're going to discover that if you make certain things null and void, there's a lot of unintended
Correct.
consequences.
And that's what I will teach my kids how to argue, which is why your kids need to know the difference between a bill and a resolution.
Mm-hmm.
But I, as the author, the writer of that, will want to do that because I don't want to deal with some of that other stuff. Does that make sense? Like, I'll say, well, that's null and void. So as the author, I'm going to want to do that.
So
when I'm debating it, I'll talk about
yeah.
that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, am I jumping ahead?
Maybe.
Because I want to talk about the null and void issue. Should we just wait for that?
Yeah, let's talk about that in a minute. I
I
don't find that this comes up in debates very often. And I judged a whole lot of Congress last year, like way more than any human should be exposed to. I think we probably judged together.
Yeah.
Like, we've been in a lot of rounds. And I don't find that this happens very often. And quite frankly, we see more resolutions than bills being proposed.
Yeah.
But the reason it's important to have them understand the difference is if it is a resolution, the kids don't want to waste time asking questions like, well, who's responsible for enforcing this? Or where's the funding going to come from? Or making those arguments. Those arguments are irrelevant on a resolution. On a bill, those arguments are relevant. So you want to make sure your kids know the difference so they know how to approach argumentatively what they're doing. Does that kind of make sense to everybody?
I mean, this is just pretend Congress. It's not like they're really trained to go out and change laws that are already in effect.
Don't tell the kids that. They think it's real all the time. I'm just kidding. You think there's life and death happening out there. Right.
Sorry to break it to you,
Daniel's
Daniel.
the realist. I bring him here because he can handle it. A resolution is going to be a little different. It states that there's a problem, just like a bill, but it offers a possible solution. I think about it as like fluffy philosophical approaches, okay? Like, let me give you an example. Here's one. Sorry. Like, resolve that the Congress here assembled recommend that the National Criminal Background Check be created by the Brady Act and be implemented. Oh, that's sweet. Okay, that's great. We don't really do anything. We just say we're gonna recommend it. Okay?
Go back to the other stuff.
So-
Sure.
Yeah, I was trying to.
Sorry, it offers a possible solution, right? So it says like, we'll make a recommendation,
Yeah.
or we stand resolved that the Rohingya people will be recognized.
That sounds familiar.
Right, I know. See, Becky, we were together. I'm positive of it. So yeah, when we start talking about Taco Truck Joe, Becky can jump in too. She knows.
She does.
I know, because we all know Taco Truck Joe, because we got talked about 27 times last year. So this is just an idea of a way to address it. I think about it as like the difference being like, we'll move from being an isolationist country to whatever. Does that make sense? It's like a philosophical change or a stance on something. Like, we will recognize the Rohingya people. What does that mean? Nothing much. Like, you're recognized. Will that maybe change foreign policy? Yes, but is there any forceful thing that's being done? Not necessarily.
He's putting down the bills from last year.
I know, he is. There's a reason I brought him. I'm a smart presenter. All right, so that's what a resolution looks like. Can we all handle that? You want to teach your kids, again, to know the difference. You don't want a kid asking questions about funding. There's no funding needed to recommend that the National Instant Criminal Background Check be implemented. Yeah.
So, in real life, you would never see a resolution like that.
You do see them in Congress.
Well, but on that specific topic, I don't think you would.
No.
Because
But that's why.
see, that's the subject where Congress has the authority to pass a bill.
Right, but sometimes
make a
Congress,
law.
you're right, but sometimes Congress will pass resolutions that then lead to committees that get to bills.
Well, I guess what I was.
Right now, our Congress isn't passing anything, let's be honest, so, right, like,
What I
we
was
just call it
thinking
duck,
was,
yeah.
This thing like the Rohingya, yeah, it's a statement of philosophy and what our
Yeah.
position is on an issue,
Uh-huh.
has no effect, we don't care, nobody else cares either.
Except when we recognize Rohingya, China's gonna get mad, or
Well,
whoever.
we now said what we
Yeah.
think about it, but on something like that,
Yeah,
I
and,
don't know that the Congress would really wanna say what they think about it, unless they're gonna do something about it.
yeah, and again, those are conversations I think you have with your kids when they want to write legislation, right? Like, I think certain pieces of resolutions certain resolutions are stronger than others. As a judge, I know very clearly which ones I, like, will get behind this one. But I wanted you to get a general, and like I said, I took these from the NSDA website, and they're ancient time periods. Here's how it works, my friends who've never done this. Welcome to the madness. Legislation is set in advance. The Speech and Debate Association sets ahead. They tell us the body of legislation that we get to choose from. We send our kids to a tournament, and they are assigned to a house, okay? Typically, at small tournaments it's gonna be 1, and big tournaments it could be 7. Like, there's a huge variety. And so sometimes you will have all of your kids from your school. If I'm in your way of not taking holler at me, all of your kids will be in one spot, and sometimes they'll be ninjaed out among 7 different houses. So it just depends on the size of the tournament, okay? But kids are assigned to a house. Kids get in, and this is where it's like the Wild West. I love it. They get to decide in that session what the docket is gonna be. There's 15 possible pieces of legislation. We've got to narrow that down so we know when we're gonna debate what. Now, my friend Daniel is gonna be one of the kids. This is where no one's in charge yet, okay? So this is the Wild West of it all. Kids are gonna come in, and if they're experienced Congress kids, someone's gonna be like, all right, let's start putting up proposed dockets. And you might have 5 kids up at the board writing out. Daniel his is A. He wants to debate pharma, civil assets, and save the bees, okay? You might come up, Becky might come up, and she knows Daniel's really good on civil assets, so she doesn't want to put civil assets in her docket. She might pick 3 other pieces of legislation. So they will set the docket in the House for 90% of the tournaments. Some tournaments will set a very specific order. Yes, ma'am?
There might be such thing as a dumb question.
No, there's not.
I don't know the definition of a docket.
The docket is just the order in which legislation will be debated.
Thank you.
Just like a Congress has the docket for the day, they know that they're first going to debate this, then maybe the Supreme Court has their docket as to what they're going to hear arguments on in that specific
That's
time.
assuming that I've never paid any attention.
That's okay, and you don't have to, and quite frankly, it's not real life. Yeah, Tracy.
Okay, so they've each put their list up. How do we choose which list?
So
we're
then
doing?
someone's going to be like, let's vote.
Okay,
Yeah.
so either of them could say, anyone in the room could say,
Yep.
let's vote. At this point, no one is in charge.
As a coach, and this is where I'm going to tell you this is an important piece, know which ones of your kids you want up at the board. Daniel's I have really strong Congress kids, so I am fine with several of my kids doing the docket. But I don't want my novice going up there and bringing the docket, like, nope. Right? In a novice house, this is a whole different jungle, okay? Because sometimes in novice houses, tournaments will set the docket so those novices don't have to do that, right? But in a varsity house, I don't necessarily want different dockets from my same team, right? I might want to have the same docket, and it's not obvious, but like, I'm gonna have Daniel do it, or I'm gonna have whoever on my team. And then we know, cause we have a team of already prepared, and I'll talk about how to prepare your kids before a tournament in a minute, but we know where we wanna go, right? I got so sick of civil asset forfeitures last year, so we tried to avoid it. Yeah, taco truck Joe. Right, and yeah, like regulation of farm industry, like we heard it so long. So what you want is your docket may change throughout the year as well, right? Like you get burned out on debating some of the same things and the arguments kind of get trite after a while, but whoever wants to can go up there. And it's kind of the Wild West. And then someone's gonna say, all right, let's vote. And they vote and we get a docket set. For our intents and purposes, we're gonna debate pharma, civil assets forfeiture, and save fees. Pay attention as a coach to the tournament preferences. Sometimes they will list a set amount of time that each bill or resolution can be debated, and sometimes they will just say, here's the session, okay? So you could debate all 2 hours, and please don't ever tell your kids to allow that to happen on pharmaceuticals. You don't want to, okay? It's really horrible. But some kids will try to debate 2 hours on pharmaceuticals. But sometimes they'll say, debate is limited to an hour. It's not very common, but it does get listed. So you want to make sure you read the invite with your kiddos and make sure they understand what's going to happen. All right, so we have a docket. We ready? We're going to debate these 3 things. Now it's time to elect a chair. And again, this is where there is some strategy as a coach. And as a new coach, you might not know right away who your strongest kids are, but it might just be your varsity members in Congress, okay? Or you might tell them to decide. I typically don't want my kids running against each other for chair. They do, because I have several that can. I also think strategically about where do I want my kiddos placed if they get elected as chair. Daniel is a great first chair. He knows what he's doing, right? He's very polished. Daniel looks like a grown-up at tournaments. It's so cute. Okay, so Daniel comes across, I know, there's more compliments I'm giving you than all year. Daniel comes across really put together, right? Like, as a coach, I know Daniel's slick and ready to go. I have another one of my kiddos who is an amazing congressional debater, but first impressions are not his strong point, okay? I'm probably not gonna run him as the first chair. Does that make sense to everybody? Because how you come across is going to matter. Now, another side note with knowing the tournament invitation. Sometimes the chair is the chair for the entire session, which may be 2 hours, okay? I don't want typically my strongest kiddo to be chair. I just don't, because he loses that ability to speak that entire session, okay? Now, sometimes I do want, sometimes it's an hour. So it just depends on what your tournament rules are, okay? And those are tournament preferences that you'll want to look. Daniel, I'm fine with being a chair for an hour. I'm not okay with Daniel being a chair for 2 hours as a coach. He's too strong of a speaker to have that not go into play. And judges view chairs and judge chairs very differently. Some judges say, oh, if Daniel's a good chair, and he is, he can set the tone for the entire 2 hours, and that's great. But in the end, I'm comparing a chair with someone who spoke 3 times. Like, how do I do that? Like, super awesome speaker, super awesome. Daniel's then kept control of the house. Everyone's got to speak. It's been super fair. How do I compare an apple and an orange? And so that's a risk when I put a kid in a chair for 2 hours. Does that make sense to everybody? So I know, right? It's really hard. Becky will tell you too, right? Like, it is an entirely different beast to try and figure out. And sometimes your kids will have preferences too. You don't mind being a chair for 2 hours.
Yeah, I don't mind it.
But I don't like him to, because he's too good of a speaker. Like, that's just my preference. But again, it's just where your kids are going to be comfortable and what your strengths are. My kiddo, who is not the smoothest speaker, cool. Take that 2 hour chair and run with it, right? He's really smart. He knows the Constitution better than any human I think I've ever met. Like, he could be on the Supreme Court. He probably would be.
He's probably going to be.
Probably
Like
would
my
be.
understanding of my
Yeah,
chair.
Yeah. So that's a kid that's like, maybe not your first chair, but like maybe your second session, you're like, dude, that's when you want to run, right? Go for those 2 hours. And that kid knows the Constitution, knows Robert's Rules of Orders, knows everything. We get a chair. Oh, wait, we got to elect a chair. Sorry, Daniel, I forgot your turn to talk. Okay, so when nominations for chair, whichever kid's up at the board, no one's in charge still at this point, is going to say nominations for chair. And Becky's going to stand up and say, I nominate Daniel. Yeah, Daniel wants to speak, okay? Daniel then gets to, someone seconds it, right? Just like Robert's procedures. And then everyone gets nominated. Okay, Daniel can decline. Here's a trick. If your kids are not strong on Robert's Rules of Orders, have them decline chair nominations until they feel comfortable. There is nothing worse than being elected as a chair and not being able to control the house. Perceptually, even when you're not chair, you look like you don't know what you're doing in the debate, and it sets a very strong tone. Okay, so it's okay to say to a kid the first couple tournaments, chair's not for you. Let's watch and see some good chairs, and then after a couple tournaments, let's put you in this chair. And that's a hard conversation as a coach to have, because kids are like, but I was chair, like it's an ego cape thing, right, or whatever. But it's okay, like, because it just, and Congress is a game of social interactions in a lot of ways, from tournament to tournament, within the tournament. Reputation and impressions matter in Congress, so you don't want someone sitting in that chair spot trying to run a house that doesn't know what they're doing and losing credibility instantly.
Yeah.
So we've got nominations. Someone will motion for a 10-second spiel from each of the candidates. And all a spiel is let them tell you why they'd be a good chair. So Daniel's gonna do his best one. He got really mad when I told him I had to do this. He had to do this. Okay, Daniels.
So spiel goes something like this. Hello, I'm Senator Ross, and I'd love to run the house today. I run a fast and efficient house. I run an open house, and I'll make sure that we can get through question priority as fast as possible, get as many speeches as we can. And remember, don't take the loss, vote Ross. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the first time I've heard you use that.
I was going to use it this year.
Okay, that's a good one. I'm like, what's that? So he said a couple things here. He says he runs an open house. Do we all know what an open house is? I've got new people. No. Okay, so here's the thing. Open house means kids can get up and exit the room as they see fit. Okay, so you don't have to raise your hand and ask for personal privilege to go to the restroom, to get a drink. Mom's texting you because the dog got out. I don't know, whatever, okay? A closed house is one in which they have to get permission from the chair to leave the room. I always encourage open houses, 1,000 times over. And the reason I do that is that when you have a closed house, those kids take away time from actual speeches and debating on things. Anytime a person has to ask a question to go to the restroom, and there's a lot in 2-hour sessions. I mean, we say 2 hours like the norm, but we've had 2.5, 3-hour sessions. Woo, buckle in, right? Pack some snacks as a judge if that's you, right? Because you're gonna need it. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to interrupt a debate to let someone go to the restroom. Okay, so that's Daniel said that. You said you run question priority, and we're going to talk about priority, but priority in a nutshell is a way of keeping track of who has spoken and who has not spoken, and giving priority to those who have not spoken. So the same kid can't stand up over and over and over again and give the same speech, because I know you're amazing. Like, you give good speeches, but my friend over here hasn't spoken at all, so I'm always going to give them priority. We also, our kids will always encourage your kids to keep a question priority. So Becky doesn't get to ask every single question because she's sitting at the front all the time. You've asked 3 questions? Oh, okay, move on. I teach my chairs to keep a seating chart. Most of the time it's already made, and you can keep track of who's sitting where. The kids will pass around a seating chart, and they just put tally marks on the seating chart, okay, for questions. Because if Becky's got 57 questions, that's great. But if you really want to ask a question and Becky's in the front and she's taller than you, you might not get seen, okay? So it's a way of keeping track of that. Speaking priority for actual speeches is kept on the board. Question priority is something done by the chair. Okay, so that's Daniel's spiel. Now, if there is more than 6 candidates for chair, you want to teach your kids to motion for a runoff, meaning that we narrow the field down. So if there's more than 6, motion for a runoff, so that you can narrow down the field and then make a little bit of a more informed choice. We good there?
Yeah.
Eventually a chair is elected. They're elected by majority. And then we get to start the debate. All of that happens before the debate. That's crazy, right? Okay, so now we get to start with the debate. The order of speech, my chairs, and if you teach your kids to do this, the minute the first chair is elected, you're going to write on the board what is 1/3 of the House, what is 1/2 of the House, which is majority. It's technically 1/2 plus 1. Fancy math girl. Okay, 1/2 plus 1 and 2/3 of the House. All of voting will depend on those 3 numbers. Okay, so we need to know how many people makes a third, because there's certain motions that require a third to vote for it. When we're passing legislation, it's 1/2 plus 1, right? It's 51% of the vote, so majority. And then 2/3 are needed for other orders. So you want the kids to just put the math on the board so there's no questions, like, what is 1/3 of the, so if it's on the board. So Daniel wrote that because that's something a chair should do right away, so there's never a confusion as to whether or not something passes or not. You already know what the numbers are needed for that. We wrote what our speech minutes time allocations are. There are some funky tournaments that will change this, but 99.9% of the set houses will follow this. The authorship speech is the first speech given. Well, before we read, hang on, I need to backtrack. You have to have the legislation read aloud. The chair should do that. I will tell you as a judge, I often sat in rounds where they would start right away with the authorship, and I'd be like, whoa, what are we debating? Like, I didn't get a copy of the legislation, and I didn't know. I mean, obviously, I can tell you what Pharma said now, if I had to, right? Because I heard that so many times last year. But you want to make sure the legislation is read, okay? Typically, the chair will do it, but teach your kids to make sure that it's always read, just so we're clear. Because sometimes you'll have bills that are closely related, and that gets a little funky. So the legislation is read. Then the authorship speech is given. In my day, way back in the dark ages, we used to call this a proponent speech. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as that. It's the same thing. It just seems like they're using authorship more frequently now. So that is the speech in which the author of the legislation gets up and tells why the piece of legislation is a good idea. Now, authorship always goes first to someone from the school who put the legislation out there. But sometimes you'll have something on the docket that is, no one is in the house that authored that speech. There's no one from Cyprus in the house. Then the chair will say, who would like to give an authorship speech for this piece of legislation? Okay. So someone else can give an authorship speech for the legislation, even if they're not the author, but it goes priority to the person from that school or the actual author. Yes, ma'am?
So how do we submit legislation?
That's through the UDCA website, and there's a link there to it. Yeah, for sure. Am I right? Am I right? Okay. Yeah, so Daniel checks me. An authorship speech is 3 minutes, and then after the authorship speech, it is a mandatory 2-minute questioning period. And lots of funky, and we're going to talk about questions in a minute, because I love good questions. Daniel does not love good questions. Yeah, and it's, as a coach, I think sometimes that's where our kids get the most nervous, right? Like, I can get up and give that speech, but don't ask me some questions. And there's nothing wrong with occasionally, it's okay as a speaker to be like, I'm not familiar with that. I need more specifics before I can answer that question. That doesn't take away your credibility. Winging it takes away your credibility, right? So there's nothing wrong, and you guys are all, I assume everyone's a teacher in here. I don't know that to be true, but I'm assuming that. I say it to my 5th graders all the time. They're like, well, this spider does this. I'm like, cool, dude, why don't you look that up and get back to me? Like, I don't know about random stuff that my 10-year-old kids say in class, and you guys get those questions in your classrooms too, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with saying, like, I don't know, or that's not something I'm familiar with, so I can address that question. You don't want to do that for every question, right? But the kids will be like, well, in Zimbabwe, this system, ooh, cool, thanks, I got nothing. And it's okay. Like, that is not a weakness. It's better to do that than, trying, I don't know, to make it up. After the authorship speech, it is the first negation speech. Again, that is a 3-minute speech, okay? And then followed by a mandatory 2-minute questioning period. So those first speech, both authorship or proponent and the negative speech, are 3 minutes followed by 2 minutes of questioning. Every subsequent speech will follow the 3-minute speech time with 1 minute of questioning. So your questioning time gets cut to 1 minute after those first 2 speeches. Okay?
So all of the speeches are 3 minutes?
Yes, sir. Now, there are some funky things that happen at funky tournaments, and so you want to just double check. And they'll say, we're using standard, and if there's something funky, typically they'll say that. So to always check the invite for it, but 99.9% of the tournaments will run that way. And kids cannot, they can't opt out of questioning, I'm not accepting any questions. No, you are, okay? And it just goes back and forth, affirmative and negative, for either until they get tired of debating it, or until the time runs out. And when I say we get tired of debating it, we get to a point where the conclusion of the debate is going to happen. That can happen because time has run out. But hopefully, once we get to a point in the debate, you've taught your kids, when there's no new arguments being made, it's time to end the debate. There is nothing worse than going back and forth on the same 3 arguments on both sides of the debate. So your kids need to know when to call what's called previous question. And I think it's the most misunderstood motion in Congress. Previous question just means we are going to vote to end the debate. That's it. We're not voting on the legislation, we're voting to stop the debate on the legislation. Okay, so kids get confused, like, oh, well, I want this bill, but maybe not, yeah.
Actually, when you vote to PQ, it is actually about to see whether you're going to pass or fail the bill, which does end the debate on the bill. So when you do a vote to PQ, you need 2/3 vote to actually enter the previous question. And once you're inside of the previous question, you need a majority vote to determine whether or not the bill
Right.
gets passed or not.
He says PQ, that just means previous question, which means we're gonna vote on the vote.
Yeah.
And then the voting on it is a subset.
And then you vote if it's going to get passed or if it's going to get failed.
So
And
it
that
takes
ends the debate
2/3 to previous question it, vote to vote, and then majority to pass the legislation.
Yeah.
Yep, and once it's done, Jang will go and write pharma, and he will write failed. Right, or exit. That's the flow of a debate. And it just keeps going forever and ever, right? Like, it's amazing. I love Congress. As a judge, I'd rather judge Congress around than almost anything else. I just like the flow of it. It's a little faster and funkier, but not everyone, it's not their jam. But I love it. Here's how it works. Now let's give you some more tips for success. And again, this just comes from my experience. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, before you move on.
Yep.
There's 2 different kinds of ways to run questions. Typically, it's, you get 1 question, no follow-up.
Yes,
Which I
that's a
don't
good point. Thank
I
you.
don't particularly like that.
I actually do as a
The NSBA
coach.
says you got 30 seconds to interact with the speaker. For me, I love that. But
Yeah.
I'm curious what your opinion is.
So I guess it depends on your kiddos. I would say with my kiddos, I'm at a point where I don't want follow-ups. I teach my chairs not to allow for follow-ups because if I allow for follow-ups, a kid can monopolize the entire questioning time period. And as a chair, I want to come across as being super fair. And if I allowed for follow-up after follow-up, it might not always be fair that you and I have that entire questioning period. And I know how NSDA does it, and I
30
get that.
seconds.
Yeah, but when we're kind of local and it's you know what I'm trying to say? Like, I don't want those same
Our
speakers.
guys aren't quite at that level yet.
Yeah, I would say,
Some-
yeah, let's be, and nationally speaking, Utah's not quite there yet, I'll be honest. That's not a bad thing. Different states and different regions have different strengths. That isn't happen to be one of ours currently. I'd love to see it change. But I also think as a chair too, the more follow-ups you allow, it just allows certain people to monopolize. Becky?
One thing that I've seen have happen with the follow-up questions is that they'll go all through the questioning period. If they have a follow-up after everyone's had a
Yeah.
chance during that 2-minute questioning period, then they can stand up and ask their follow-up question then.
Yeah.
So that they're not monopolizing the time, but they still have that opportunity to ask another question to maybe glean more information that will then help them
Can I
further on.
suggest a different way of looking at it? Just for what it's worth.
Uh-huh.
It's hard to ask one good question and really accomplish anything. But if you can ask a question to get somebody to take a position and then make a follow-up, right, that's where you get to be able to test
I
them.
think it's better to
And so-
save the follow-up for a speech, is what I'm gonna tell you.
You know,
And that's why I don't, yeah.
I like the, okay, there's 4 of you, each get 30 seconds, and then you're out.
Yeah.
Next 4.
And to be fair, and I understand your point, in a smaller house, that strategy is better to do.
But when
But
you're running 30 kids plus
Yeah,
in a house,
It's hard.
it's really hard.
Yeah,
Point
and
well
so,
taken.
yeah, you know, if there's 15 kids and one is the chair and I've only got 14 speakers, the follow-ups don't become a problem. If there's 32 kids in a house and I've been in 35 and up to almost 40, yeah, welcome to some of the big Salt Lake tournaments, right? Like, it's a lot, and so I don't want a speaker. I also teach my chairs to encourage questions to be asked in 10 seconds and answered in 10 seconds. I know one of the coaches last session, right, asked about whether or not I teach my kids to go on in answering the question, and I do not teach my kids to do that. I don't think extemporizing this long answer makes my kids look more credible. I want my kids to be able to answer as many questions, and I think it shows ability and openness to answer those questions versus like trying to drive the debate. Now, you're gonna get kids that speak and they're like, I just want to talk about what I want to talk about, I don't want to answer a question. You know, they get super nervous. Those kids are gonna go on forever to try and answer a question, and the reality is they're probably not gonna answer the question that was asked to begin with. That happens, but your high kids and your kids you're prepping to be at that higher level are gonna get out the answer and be quick about it. And Daniel knows, like, he's gonna be like, yep, it's gonna raise taxes, moving on. He knows, right? He'll deal with that later. He's fine with that answer. He's fine with that answer, because later on in the debate, that'll come out. But the kids that are like, well, we'll raise taxes, but that's okay, because we talk about taxes all the time, and taxes go up. But, it's a very different flow to answering questions. So encourage your kids to be concise in their answers. They look more credible because they can answer those questions and move on. Yeah.
And part of their prep is them coming up with questions. They're already going to know, Daniel's nodding in his head, they're already going to know what questions will be asked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm going to talk about
And
questioning.
if they hear a really good question that somebody else has asked, they should darn well write that down
I'm gonna
so
talk
that they
about that.
themselves,
Becky, you're the
in another
best.
tournament,
Yeah.
can ask that same question, then they look like this.
We need to judge more together, Becky.
I know, right?
And I'm like, now the more you talk, I'm like, I know we've judged a lot together.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about how to prep your kids to be ready for these congressional debates. This is, my kids are so excited. Daniel just found out. Get your kids world books for Congress. Some sort of almanac, some sort of, and they can take them with them into the rounds. Daniel just found out this morning he's getting his. He's so excited, right? My stepers get them, but my Congress kids get them. Just
And
something
they can
basic.
take them into the
Heck
round.
yeah, they can. Why not? It's not an electronic resource.
Right.
You're entitled to electronic resources.
Well, yeah, but it's just like, get them there. If they don't know what the Ecuadorian government system is, boom, right? And it's gonna come up, right? There's all sorts of, so these world almanacs, books of facts, world books, amazing, amazing resources. Get every Congress kid a pocket constitution. I've got mine in my backpack somewhere.
Personally, I would say that the Constitution is the most important thing you can get a Congress kid, because when you get into really technical Congress debates, you can do something called an objection to consideration, which is basically saying we cannot pass this bill because it is unconstitutional, therefore debating on it is useless.
Yep.
So if they can understand the Constitution, it makes it that we can make so we have more time to
Yep.
debate bills that actually matter.
Yeah, and invest or get a parent to donate pocket constitutions. They're like $2 a piece, or some of
I
the
got it for $1
Yeah,
a piece.
and
on
some of
some
your civic
website.
organizations, like your Lions clubs and stuff like that, might donate them to your school too. So that's a really good investment, especially if you only have 10 Congress kids. Like if you go to your VFWs and things like that, they're like, kids want to constitute, okay, And a lot of times your school gets freebies of them too and just puts them in a closet because they don't, yeah. So government sites, anything that ends in .gov is a great place to go.
Where?
Government sites, anything that ends in .gov.
Okay.
Go to the Department of Labor for your statistics. Go to the FBI or wherever, right? Go to those sites. I think kids are really good at Google, but they're not so good at credible source finding. And so teaching them that those .gov sites, especially when you're supposed to be a congressional body, you want to go to official sites, right? Like that makes the most sense. Yes, the BBC is credible. It's not as credible as a .gov site for this particular kind of debate. Makes sense. The last I say use very, very sparingly. This is where you would have a specific testimony that your kids would research to support one way or the other on a piece of legislation. So we debated civil assets forfeiture last year, a lot. And I heard about Joe, the taco truck owner. You're laughing, because we've heard about Joe, Becky and I. Okay, and Joe, he was just running a taco stand, and they thought he was doing something illegal, but it turned out he wasn't. So even though he never went to trial, his taco truck was seized. And Joe's taco truck never came back, because it cost Joe more money to go get the taco truck back from the government than it is to just buy a new taco truck. So Joe was out of work from his taco. I heard so many taco and burrito questions about Joe, the taco truck owner last year. You would be amazed. I know Joe, what kind of tacos he made, right? Like, we love Joe. So testimonies can be really helpful, but they can also skew the debate. So we're just talking about taco trucks and we're not talking about overall civil assets forfeiture. There's a time and a place for emotional appeals. When we're talking about big pharmaceuticals, right? You probably want the story of someone who can't afford diabetes medicine, right? Insulin or whatever because of the cost. Cool. But that should be a point of support, not your entire argument. So testimonies are good. Just make sure your kids are using them sparingly and appropriately. If we've talked about Joe so many times and so much, his appeal is not there anymore, right? His testimony doesn't matter. All right, some other things. I call this beyond the prepared speech. And this is where Congress, our coaches kind of look at me like, say what? These Congress kids have to do just as much work as another event? At the highest levels, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. And it's shocking. Like, whoo, your students must flow the debate. Okay, that is it. I know I feel like I'm committing heresy here to say this, right? But or, like whatever. It's an important tool. I told them to flow the debate, and they were like, Sarah. He was like, I do Congress. I was like, no, but we flow debates now. And the reason why, and I don't care if you teach them to flow in columns and color-coded symbols, they have to keep a running record of what's happening in the debate. There is nothing worse than a Congress session where every single speech is a memorized speech after another prepared speech after another prepared speech, and there's no clash of arguments or ideas. Cool. Becky stands up and says her prepared speech. I stand up and say my prepared speech, then Daniel, and we don't talk about anything that relates to each other. It's not a debate. It's just the battle of prepared speeches. If I'm flowing the debate, I'm like, oh, Becky said this, and that's a good idea, but here's my evidence against it. Okay? You have to teach your kids to flow Congress debates. And in the post-round discussion, like after tournaments, where your kids are preparing for the next tournament, they're going to take out those flows. And they're going to be like, oh, Sarah's point about whatever is something I wasn't prepared for. I need to go look up an answer to that. I need to figure out some evidence that I can say against Sarah's point. They have to flow the debate. Because here's what happens. They're 15, and they go home, and they have Burger King that wasn't good, and they get food poisoning, and then they break up with their boyfriend, and by the time you talk to them on Monday about what happened, it's gone. Right? I mean, sometimes it's an hour later. You see them at lunch, and they have no idea what happened in that debate, right? Like, that's just going to be the case. They're high school kids, and we love them for that. If they don't flow, they don't have any way of moving forward to prepare. It's just the same old, same old. Now, another thing Daniel hated me for, but it made a difference. I cut them off on reading pre-prepared speeches after the first two speeches. I know, right? Are you shocked?
No.
Good, thank you.
I said the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, and the kids look at you like, say what? We prepare arguments, okay? We prepare arguments. We prepare our prepared speeches, but we prepare arguments. So when Becky gets up, and if I'm the third negative speaker, I want to respond to all of those arguments, okay? I want to have some arguments that are unique, because I have a list of arguments. I don't have a list of speeches. I'm going to get up and be like, here's the 3 best points we have left that haven't been made, and here's arguments against the things that have already been said. It's a responsive debate. Crazy, right? It happens in student Congress when done well. You have to be responsive. And if all you're doing is standing up and reading the next prepared speech, and Daniel reads his next prepared speech, and you read dude, it is like watching paint dry as a judge. And there's no debate. The kids don't learn the argumentation skills, okay? So they have to flow, and they have to get beyond the prepared speech and practice, right? What would you say? Oh, if you're a coach, what would you say, Becky, if this is the argument given against your speech? What's going to be your answer? So practicing that. Teaching your kids common logical fallacies is important in Congress. They get thrown around like confetti. Slippery slope, it happens all the time. Well, if we do this, then we're just gonna, everything is gonna be bad, and then it's gonna be war. And you're like, okay, calm down. So teach your kids to recognize those logical fallacies. I mean, hopefully in a debate group, we're doing that anyway. Make sure you understand what is an ad hominem. Daniel gets picked on a lot. And what's a strandman argument? What's a slippery slope argument? So that the kids are able to do that. I know I've only got about 5 minutes left, so I'm trying to be responsive. Questions on these things? I got more. Tips and tricks. Flow the debate, I think I've talked about that. Get your friend. That's a really ugly one. Mine would be in like prettier colors because I like purple and green and fun stuff, but yeah. Flow the debate. Be the chair, okay? Your novice kids, that's a whole different ballgame. Let any one of your novice kids do whatever they want, whenever they want. Let them go, okay? If it's a novice house. But if they're in a varsity house, or if there's only one house, you want to make sure you know as a school, what is your strategy going to be, and who's ready to be the chair. Jacob's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, so pretty much you want a good chair because the chair determines the speed of the round itself. The chair determines whether or not it's going to be the difference between a minute between speeches or 5 seconds between speeches. So you want someone who you know is going to be a good chair. So as she was saying, you wouldn't want to put someone who's just going into varsity as a chair because then their reputation is going to be hurt and they're probably not going to get as good of a score as they could if they were to just give speeches. But pretty much as chair, what you do is you direct everything in the debate. After you're elected chair, you instantly move into the motion to debate on whatever bill is set in the docket, which would be pharma for us right now, and then you call up speakers. So I'd be like, okay, motion to open debate on pharma. I'd give you 5 seconds to prepare, and immediately after I'd be like, anyone with an affirmation speech prepared, please rise. And instantly after, then of course, if there was an authorship speech, I would pick someone and get started right away.
Daniel speaks fast. It's okay. We all speak fast. Yeah.
So then immediately after, I'd do questioning period. As chair, I'm in charge of timing everything. I'm in charge of keeping questioning priority and normal priority to make sure that everything runs in line and everything runs smoothly. So it's a big job to have. That's why you don't want anyone who's inexperienced to be in it.
Daniel also will be very clear. Teacher chairs that they should do everything on the top of the gavel. Did I already tell you guys that? I'm getting confused on what I've said. Both sessions. Yeah, gavel taps are super important. Whether it's a marker or gavel tapping, right? But NSDA does everything on the top of the gavel. And so what it does allow, because what happens is you finish that first negation speech, and if you don't set the tone or have your kids set the tone that it's going to be on gavel taps, instantly kids are going to start rising, right? If Daniel set the tone at the top of my gavel, if you're interested in an affirmation speech, please rise, then there's some decorum to it. It makes it more fair, and it's just a smoother run house. Daniel also wants to keep that as fast as he can. Like, he talks fast, but it's done partially for a reason, right? So we can move into the next speech. So teach your chairs to gavel tap everything. Yeah? Sweet. Robert's Rules of Orders. I recommend, if you're a new coach or even experienced coach, get your kids something that is easily accessible. Like, I've seen kids have like the little bound books. I think those are hard for kids to understand. A one-page cheat sheet is really all they need. They need to know like the major motions, like motion to, open the debate, previous question, amend, stuff like that. And you can find tons of cheat sheets online. They're really simple to find and not too bad. I've seen kids come in with a whole book. There's very few things you're going to need. I don't know that I ever used one, ever. Yeah. After the debate, right? You keep your flows for that reason. Okay, what we weren't ready for? What weren't we ready for? Or what was the best argument that was made on whatever? Or, okay, Daniel gave a really good speech on whatever. Okay, can I steal some of his points and use it for my next speech and correct those arguments? And then if Daniel and I are going against each other, if I beat Daniel to the punch, whoopsie, whatever, right? Like if I have I can speak before Daniel, or I know how to use those arguments against Daniel. So there's a lot of reasons to have those kids flow that debate. I think it's important to review your ballots with your kiddos. Good Congress judges will give kids feedback about what was effective or ineffective about their speeches. And if your kids are not responsive to their ballot comments, you're not doing them any favors. So make them have some sort of accountability. Okay, I want you to go back and write me a paragraph summarizing what your ballot said. Okay, or I want you to work with the Congress captain and talk about the 3 biggest pieces of feedback we got about, whatever. However your process is for making your kids do that, but some sort of ballot review, even in Congress, I know it's crazy, is important. You're going to see the same kids over and over and over and over, and the same judges, right? There's like probably 10 of us that will do it and like it, or whatever, and so they see a lot of the same judges. Those feedback pieces are super important.
The tough part though with that is a lot of times for Congress especially,
Yeah.
there's nothing.
Yeah,
There's
and
like nothing except your score.
And I think that's valid too. So teach your parents or whoever it is that's judging to even like if you do any sort of parent orientation on judging, which a lot of us do for our coaches or for our parents, like a real quick, or if you give some sort of document to your parents on how to judge, you might want to say comments for Congress might look something like this and encourage them always to do that too. Because if you as a coach are encouraging it, it gets a little bit better.
I think the problem though is because especially when you have new judges,
Yeah.
And there's so many of them and they're already trying to keep track and trying to keep up.
Yeah.
And we have to get them in because they have to be tagged.
For sure.
Have to keep the tournament going.
But you can always go back and edit that.
Right, but the thing is then they forget who's who and all that.
Yeah, I mean,
so the hard part with that though,
right, and sure, like if there's nothing there, there's nothing there. I will tell you when I judge Congress on every speech, there's 3 to 5 comments for every speech a kid gives in a session. And if a kid's giving 3 sessions, you've got 15 pieces of feedback for me. And sometimes they'll be the same, like, oh, still didn't have a warrant for this claim, and
Still playing with your shirt sleeve.
right, I mean, whatever, but, and again, like I've been doing this a really long time, so I'm able to track it at a different level, but you're gonna get people like me, and those are gonna be the judges that you're gonna really wanna look at those ballots. When there's nothing there, you can't obviously do anything about it, but.
Oftentimes when I give Congress ballots, because we can't really, the way that tab room is set up, we can't really give
know.
them specifics.
Well, that's what
I
I
just
mean.
keep a running total, you know, and I'll have a seating chart that I myself make out with their names,
Yeah,
and I'll just keep a running total of everything, and I'll just,
well, and
that's
everything's
us.
like
I'm talking-
everybody's
I'm
comments.
talking about for the ballots that we get back that are blank. I'm not talking about us.
Yeah,
'cause
for
we
sure.
know how to do this.
yeah,
But
I mean,
not
obviously, yeah,
everybody
if there's
does.
nothing there, there's nothing there, but, you know, but but regardless of whether or not there's something on the ballot, then ask them, okay, why do you think you got a 9 in this round? Like, have them be reflective even in that process. They might know, but, you know, then they might not, but at least there's an attempt to have that discussion, and if they've got the flows, okay, so here's what you did in the debate, where could you have been different? You know, we do redo speeches in LD and policy all the time, right? That's a typical practice to do. How many of us ask our kids to do, I need to start doing that for you guys. Thanks, good idea. Speech redos for Congress speeches.
yeah.
Like, it sounds crazy, right? But why would we treat Congress different than any other debate event? But we do. And so there's an acknowledgement, like, there's nothing wrong with, like, dude. Okay, that was not the most responsive speech. You know, you read way too, like, and making our Congress kids do speech redos. I know it's crazy. You're welcome, Daniel. You're gonna get that this year.
Yeah, it's gonna be great.
Great. The joy, right? Sarcasm is fun. Priority. Now, I know, right? This is a chart that will always be kept on the board.
Yep.
Always. The chair will always be your first kid listed. Jimmy's the
So,
chair.
yeah, Jimmy would be the chair.
Jimmy is the chair, right? So your chair is the first one. And so Jimmy automatically gets his first priority removed. He gets moved to second priority. Tommy's up next. So, and it will go on and on and on. And once a kid gives a speech, they move a column over. You always give priority to the kids who are in the lowest column.
Yeah.
So Jeff, if Tommy and Jeff both rise to speak, Tommy gets priority, he's ahead of Jeff, then Jeff goes. Once Tommy speaks, we cross him out, we move him over, okay? Certain chairs will do that for questioning speeches. Depending on how your Congress, the tournament will work. Some will work that it is the same house all tournament, and then some will do, like if you're in longer sessions, you're gonna have to erase in between sessions, because you're gonna get like up to 7 or 8 priority, right? So you have to move. But keep priority. I'm gonna go really quickly. Last things, because I know it's time to go back to the general session. Know where there might be blocks in the room. By blocks, we mean groups of kids that are aligned with each other. Not always necessarily from the same school, although oftentimes it is. But again, it's a social game. And so we know Mac's our friend. Well, he was our friend most of the
He
time.
graduated.
He graduated. Mac, I can use Mac, right? Mac was from Cyprus?
He was from Cottonwood.
Cottonwood, that's what I meant. Same yellow. Okay, so Mac was like with our kids a lot. It wasn't always the same, side on every debate, but we knew where our social game was with certain members. And it's important that your kids acknowledge that. So you've got to teach them a little bit about reading a room, right? If you notice that the same kids are always supporting the same kids for chair, that probably means something. What does that say? You also want to prevent, if you have kids from your school in the same house, prevent them from sitting as a cluster. Like they often will try to do that. Like, oh, we're from the same cool. Yeah, that doesn't do anyone any favors, right? Now, every time I ask Daniel a question, if it's a friendly question, they automatically assume. So I want my kids spread out across the room. It also allows them to social network with a different group of kids by being in different places and meet some of the kids, especially from some of you from smaller schools that might have, these big, huge houses. So you want to spread your kids out a little bit. Know who likes to be chair, both when you're coaching your kids and also when they're talking about kids from other schools. There are some kids that don't like to be chair, and so in acknowledging that and playing that game. Also, I teach my kids to know where certain speakers are on preferred sides of legislation. I know Becky always wants to speak negative on civil assets forfeiture.
Because that's what my speech is that I've written.
Right, she's already written it, and it's a pay speech. So I might try using priority to prevent Becky from giving that speech, because I have more priority than she does. So I might try to speak ahead of Becky, because I've kept flows. I know what Becky's going to say. I can already address some of the things Becky's going to say before she says it, so her speech isn't as powerful. crazy, right? It's totally an event. It's like you have to teach your kids to think sometimes a step ahead of the other speakers in the room, right? Daniel really loves to speak negative on pharma. Cool. I'm going to use my priority or give a speech negative on pharma before he can. And maybe that the debate ends on pharma before Daniel can give his really good speech on pharma.
Sometimes that's a strategy they use too.
Yep. They'll call previous question before they know someone who speaks really well gets a chance to speak on it. Okay, it's a strategy. And it seems kind of schemy at times, but that's just part of the Congress game. It's no different than prepping a disadvantage against a certain policy plan or things like that. There's nothing ethical wrong with doing that. It's just part of knowing the room.
It's just how it is.
Yep.
You get thrown
Yes,
into
sir.
something, it's just-
So if you're the new kid from a small school and you walk in there by yourself, you're basically screwed.
Nope. If I'm a new kid, I'm like, hey, I'm Sarah. Nice. Where are you from?
Well, I'm from Mount
Oh, I'm from Beaver. I don't know.
so
Is
cool.
Beaver in the room? Did I offend anybody? I don't know. Okay. I was like, yeah. Have you been to a lot of tournaments with some of these people? Okay, so I'm doing this. You've got to have an outgoing kid to do that. But if it's a kid that wants success, they're gonna do that. Hey, so, do you like to chair?
Oh yeah, I'd
Oh,
love to
okay,
check.
cool. So
Could you nominate me?
I would love to know.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're not screwed. It's a social game. Yeah, it's a social game. And you're gonna see, you small schools are gonna see those same big schools in a lot of places. Park City, lots of schools have big schools that run big Congress contingencies. There's nothing wrong with making friends with those schools. Make friends, always make friends in debate. It's, the life for us. But there's nothing wrong with it.
The only strategy against a block is just to join another,
No,
right?
no,
Okay.
I think there's
What
nothing
do you
wrong
do?
with saying, call out the block, right? Daniel keeps asking my girl a question. I'm gonna prevent Daniel from asking the question by doing either asking that question ahead of Daniel, okay? Or I'm going to make an argument that prevents him from asking that question when I speak, right? If I know Daniel is always gonna vote for his, we've got 7 kids in our Congress team right now, 7, 8, 27, I don't know, we got a lot. So I might prevent them from nominating each other by motioning to close nominations sooner. Okay? Or in between the next session, if I see him and Mac, who are from different schools but still closely aligned, I might come and sit in between them. So there's nothing wrong with it. And it doesn't have to be like a scheming thing, but yes, sometimes bigger schools do have an advantage, but a lot of times they don't. I can tell you as a judge, the first time I judged Congress this year, I had no idea who was from what school. I've been out of the high school circuit for a couple of years, and I had no idea. And afterwards, they were like, "Oh, those are from what school?" And I was like, "Oh." So the good schools that have bigger blocks are gonna not be so obvious about a block either. So just watch. I think you have to teach your kids the art of social interaction in Congress. It is not an event where they don't, a lot of times coaches just stick the kid in the back of the room that doesn't want to ever speak. I say don't do that, right? If you have a kid that doesn't want to participate in debate but has to go to a tournament, don't put them in Congress. Put them in impromptu, right? Make them have to get up and speak, because you can put them in Congress and they can sit there for 2 hours and never give a speech, right?
I make the kids that do that on my team pay their entry fee.
Yeah, and I just, that doesn't happen to us. We
Every
just,
fun.
yeah. So put those kids in another event where they're like, it is your turn to speak, come on. You're not gonna say no to that, or you might and cry,
Yeah.
but it's fine. And all surrounds, there's lots of tears. But I don't allow, that just doesn't happen. So yeah, I think blocks will change throughout the year too, right? There are times when people are really nice to us and they're like, dude, you totally messed us up on that debate and called PQ and I still want to speak. And then they're not friends again. So remember, we're dealing with fickle teenagers and sometimes fickle coaches with fickle teenagers. And so those things are very, very fluid throughout the year. I'm gonna give you my email address. It's my school email address. We turn off the projector, Dan. It's over here, I think. Sarah Erickson at apamail.org. I'm pretty responsive to that. I'm happy to help. At any point, I'm happy to help. I really love this event. It's really weird that I do, because I was an extemper and an LDR and a policy debater, but I love this event. I love it. It is, to me, one of the areas as a state that we can grow. and it's a huge challenge to do it, but if we start using and treating it like other events, this activity gets better. So if you have any questions, feel free to holler. I know you have your closing session, so thank you all.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. You stayed for both.
Yeah,
That's all right, I'll allow it.
I missed the first part of the first.
Yeah, maybe you got some. I don't know. Where are you from?
South.
Oh, nice. Daniel, you get to go home.
Yeah, I know, I was just thinking like that.
I know, you're like, what do I have to do? What's that?
Q&A.
Oh, where did Yeah. If you will help us straighten back out the desks if you move them, that would be fantastic. I promise. Not break anything. Daniel, so make sure we get your MSA. Tell me your question. Oh, that's right, I recognized your music. I couldn't remember, because I've seen you so many times. So, are you gonna run Congress Killers a lot this year?
My kids love it. It's so funny because, Highland used to be a policy school.
Back when I was competing, for sure.
Huge policy
Yeah,
school.
back when Dave was still coaching
Yeah,
and everything, yeah.
but then everything just kind of died down, and then everybody hated it. So
Sweet.
I came on board, and then I
Yeah.
got a former congressperson come in,
Yeah. It makes a difference.
and that kid
That's
came in
awesome.
and spoke. And
Yeah, I
they
know,
loved
like, I
it.
know
They
I
loved it.
recognized you, I just couldn't remember what school.
Yeah.
And it's so weird, because they were like, when they were trying to decide who was gonna lead the session, like, technically I'm just a mom, right? Like, my son competes, but.
You're a mom judge?
Well, yeah, right? Oh, no, you've heard my joke about that. Like, I was in a round and one of the kids was like, "You're a mom judge that flows?" And I was like, "I'm an all-American mom judge who flows. Like, bring it." Like, you're not gonna go faster than I can handle. But they were so funny. The kids were like so demeaning to me. I was like, okay, I may be a mom, but like, let's not assume that all mom judges, but
Where I kind of like.
Well, that's what you're taught to do. is
Right,
you're a
like,
mom judge.
mom judge, so you don't know anything. I'm not your mom judge.
No, I've told my kids, first of all, don't use that term. I'm like,
Yeah.
'cause if anything,
Moses
your
does
mom
too.
is the biggest judge of who you are.
For
So,
sure.
don't.
Thank you for your questions. Remind me where you coach at. I know it's a small school.
Lone Peak. It's
Oh,
actually a very big
not
school.
small school anymore, yeah.
No, what years were you active?
So high school locally, 91 to 94. Then I did 4 years of college debate here. Then I worked at Cornell and Cal State Long Beach.
Cool.
And hang on, there's some more, but I can't
So
remember.
I was early eighties, I was
Oh, okay, yeah.
trying to find somebody
Yeah.
for my.
No, I actually, my sophomore year, I debated with the former Lone Peak debater, Sherika Kelly was mine. She's back in those, yep, she was a year behind me. That was Sharon West was the Lone Peak team. But that was still when you guys had, like, your policy teams, Greg and Danny, like, yeah, see, I go way back to some of this, but, yeah, I was a Kearns
So
girl.
I've only been a coach there, this is my second year.
Yeah,
And they've kind of been down for 4 or 5
Yeah.
years. But I'm looking to try to find alumni in the area that might be.
so I might be able to get you in touch with Sherika, because I'm friends with her on Facebook and she's a Lone Peak alum.
Is she in the area again?
She's in Salt Lake, she works at eBay. Yeah.
I'd like to,
Okay, cool. If you reach out to me and send me an email, I'll send you her name and her contact. I have some contact info for her,
all right.
so, yeah,
Thank you.
but for sure, yeah.
So, my guess is really the only way to beat a blowout is to just be so prepared that you can speak on any side of anything.
But I
And
think
then
that
it
will
doesn't
be,
matter what you.
and I think then blocks don't matter anyway.
Well, from my own personal experience, when there's a block around, normally you can negotiate, no matter if you're in the block or not in the block. Because there's still people, they're not gonna just throw it in their heart. If you talk to somebody like, I have a speech, can you please just wait PQ for just one more space, then normally they'll allow it.
And even if, blocks too, they're still priority. So blocks